Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Brown, Senior Academic Officer at FastBridge Learning, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's webinar. Today, we're going to be learning from Sally Grimes about how to prevent long-term reading problems by building a framework for early identification and intervention of dyslexia. Sally Grimes has served in a variety of positions in her 35 years in the fields of reading, language, and learning disabilities. She received her master's degree in reading and human development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and her bachelor's degree from the Honors College at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has taught all levels ranging from Head Start to graduate school. As the founding director of the Grimes Reading Institute, Sally has provided professional development and consultation in the area of reading to thousands of teachers and administrators, assisting schools with improving the outcomes of their literacy initiatives. Sally served as an appointed member of both the Massachusetts Governor's Commission on School Readiness and the Content Advisory Committee of the Massachusetts Tests for Educator Licensure. Welcome, Sally. She will present for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion for your questions and her answers. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Everyone's lines will be muted during the webinar, and so if you have questions, please use the questions feature in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you cannot get the internet audio option to work, it may be due to a firewall issue at your school or district, and in that case, please choose the dial by phone option instead. Okay, Sally, you can begin.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for signing up for this webinar. And I'm so excited that there is such a variety of disciplines represented. And that's apropos to this topic because especially this topic takes a village to pull this off, this idea of collective responsibility and having ways to cross-fertilize, so to speak, with the various disciplines. These are all of our kids, and we have to work as teams. So it's great that we have school psychologists and special ed teachers, administrators, parents, Title I teachers, general ed teachers, a large variety of people. So without further ado, we'll start right in. This is what we're going to focus on. Why is early identification so important? And sadly now, it's a wait to fail model, so to speak, in a lot of the situations. So we have to get these kids much earlier than we're getting them. These kids, by these kids, I mean the struggling readers. What does the research say? How do we identify these at-risk readers? And who are they? Are they always dyslexic? That answer is no. So why is it so important? Well, obviously, we don't want kids to fail and feel that emotional stress. Part of my early learning and work was in working with kids with emotional disabilities. And I'm very tuned in to the kids that suffer because they feel stupid, so to speak. And we have to prevent that feeling of failure. We don't want so many kids to be sent down the hall to special ed. We want to work with parents and the public. And some of the strategies I'll talk about today are good for all kids. So that's kind of a key point. And with dual language learners, they need to learn the English phonemes. So a lot of what we're talking about today with phonemic awareness will be a huge boost to the kids for whom English is a second language. One of my favorite researchers, Dr. Joseph Torgerson, University of South Florida, has written, he's a pioneer in the early identification. I would strongly urge you to go to his work. You'll see this article in the American Educator, which, by the way, has a lot of great articles in it. And basically, I'll read the first sentence or so. Children who are destined to be poor readers in 4th grade almost invariably have difficulties in kindergarten and 1st grade with the critical phonological skills, the phonemes, the blending sounds, the distinguishing sounds, the matching sounds to print, all that. And those are the very areas that show up over and over and over, even as they go into middle school, if we don't catch these kids. So what does the research say? I'm sure you've heard of the Shaywitzes, Ben and Sally Shaywitz from Yale, who did a lot of seminal work in brain structure and watching dyslexics read, so to speak. So here we have the brains of 2 5-year-olds. We're looking down at the tops of their heads. And at the bottom of the PowerPoint is the space where their foreheads would be. Now we can see the child on the left is not at risk. Why? Because the neuroanatomy programmed for phonology is in that left frontal lobe where it's supposed to be. And then you look at the child who's at risk, and that left frontal lobe doesn't have that activity. So that child's going to have to build new neural pathways, and that can be done. And that's what we do when we remediate kids. We're actually building brains, so to speak. So if you don't know that work, it's probably important to go investigate it a little bit. When we say we're using evidence-based screeners and evidence-based interventions and reading programs, we want to be sure of the way these programs and tools were researched. Was it evidence-based? Because a lot of times programs say they're research-based, but we don't know the full story on that. We have to think about, did they use the right hypotheses that built on what we already know? Were the studies replicable and replicated? Were there enough in the subject samples? Then were those samples similar to our population? And was it quantitative, qualitative? How were the studies done? And were they peer reviewed in journals? Those are really important questions to find out whether you're using a reading program or a screener or an assessment tool of any kind. We have over 100,000 studies about the right way to teach reading. We know what to do, and we just have to do it now. And it hasn't been done because it's not that easy. If it were easy, it would have been done by now. But we have a reading crisis in this country, as you probably know. And all the interest in dyslexia is now gaining prominence. And so that's spurring everybody to think more about the reading crisis. How do we identify these kiddos? Well, we borrow from the medical field. In the medical field, we take people's temperatures to see if there is an infection or something. We take their blood pressure and we measure, and we can do that with education. We can give screening assessments, and this is a nice nice slide that I would suggest you print and laminate and keep handy, because basically it's the 4 kinds of assessments. Today we're talking about universal screening and a little bit about progress monitoring, because that's critical. When you screen, you have to also monitor the progress. And so we want to find out which students are already in big trouble when they're 4 and 5 years old, and then you can screen onward into elementary school, of course. This slide is self-explanatory. A lot of these slides I will not have time to comment on, so you'll see me flipping through them rather quickly, but I put the slides in knowing we wouldn't be able to talk about all of them in depth, but I wanted you to have them in, to refer back to. The idea number 2 on this of shadow scoring, some people may not be familiar with that, but when we train people to give certain screening tools, the person who's skilled in this would sit with the child, but in back of the person doing the assessment, there would be people learning the assessment, and they would be silent, but they would listen to the child and keep score on their own separate score pads. Then when the child leaves, everybody gets together and sees how closely matched the score sheets are. And if there's a way that the people learning this aren't keeping score the right way, then it's discussed and they practice. It's very important that everybody screen the right way. These screeners tell you that something is wrong. We don't know what exactly. We don't know if it's long vowels or short vowels or phonemic awareness or multisyllabic words, but we can find that out. What we want to know is who's in trouble. And then you can give something like the Quick Phonics Screener. You can find that on the web, or for Phonemic Awareness, PAST, the past. And you'll notice with the screeners, they dwell on how quickly and automatically a child does something. It's not a race, but it's also very important that the child uses or has automaticity, because they have to, what Jean Shaw, my professor with whom I was privileged to study, she always called it ungluing the print from the page. So they have to get that print off the page quickly, because if you don't know what the word is, you can't know what the word means. Now, you'll notice with the screeners, there's an emphasis on phonics and phonemic awareness. And that's because it's the most troublesome area for struggling readers. In my 40 plus years of doing this kind of work, I've seen so many older kids, big, tall basketball players that I used to tutor, and they never understood phonemic awareness. One young man said, "I thought you had to memorize the look of all the words." I said, "No." He said, "I mean, there's a system?" And I said, "Yeah, let's learn the system." Now, here's the part about progress monitoring. Basically, we want to progress monitor the real low level kids that are showing us they're in trouble every couple weeks, because we don't want to continue the intervention if the intervention isn't adequate, if it isn't the right intervention. We want to check to see what's going on. Are they making progress? There should always be an upward trajectory. If it's flatlining, then we have a problem. We have to look at what we're doing. We're looking at what the interventions are, who's doing the intervening, etc. We want to help teachers spot these high-risk kids. They're kind of detectives. They can spot, assess, and instruct these potential struggling readers. And when I go in a classroom and I pull a kid aside and sit down in a corner and see what he knows, I'm, sharing that data and that information with the teacher afterwards. And often the teacher said, "I had no idea he didn't know how to do that or how to do that, or how he was struggling," because teachers have a lot of kids to look at. And I have the privilege of, pulling one kid aside and seeing up close and personal, so to speak. So what do these children look like? They often, but not always, have poor oral language and listening problems. There's often a history of ear infections. There's all these issues you see on this slide. And again, you'll have this to refer to. But down at the bottom, the last two I want to spend a minute on. The family history of dyslexia or other learning problems is a big red flag. If a child is the son or daughter of a parent with dyslexia, there's up to a 50% chance that that child will be dyslexic, will have dyslexia. And it's hard for parents to meet a teacher and bare their soul. So you really have to develop relationships with these parents and get them to trust you and tell you. And often it takes them a couple months to say, "You know what? I never used to go to the library because I'm afraid of reading. I struggled in school, et cetera, et cetera." The last one, difficulty learning letter names, names of colors, they'll know what yellow is. They'll know what the colors are, but the labels are very difficult sometimes. That's a red flag when they're in, say, kindergarten, and they can't get the labels for the colors the right way. And you have to look, well, did they just learn this, or have they been trying to learn this for a couple of years? Now, these are other observations. Sometimes it's very subtle. They circumlocute. That means they talk in circles. They never get to the point. They can't describe what they did the night before or the movie they saw, or they have trouble with finding the right words, trouble with organizations. They stay kind of quiet, or else they jabber all the time, but it's not language on demand. It's just verbiage that often doesn't make a lot of sense. And sometimes they're immature. Now, I once saw this wonderful principal named Jo Robinson speak at a Reading First conference years ago. I never forgot her. She was amazing. And one of the things she said was this quote, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And I think getting all the teachers on board with getting the same kind of data from the same kind of screener is very, very important. And using that data, and like Jim Barksdale said, if it's a matter of data, then everybody's facts are equal. But if it's a matter of opinion, then my opinion counts more than anybody's. I've been at data meetings where one or two teachers might not have used the data, the screener, and they used something else, but it was more anecdotal and not scientific, and so it didn't agree. And there can be some consternation sometimes at some of these meetings. So we want everybody to be skilled with using the same kind of data. And again, measuring everything. Who are these readers? Well, there are two main reasons why students struggle: neurological and environmental. Let's talk about neurological. The wiring, it's kind of a slang term for what we're built for in our brains, so to speak. You know, in your circle, family members or friends that are just wired well for music or for art or for sports or for engineering. Or, I mean, some of these, you can see some of these kids when they're 3 years old, they're masters at Legos, and when you follow them, you see that that's kind of wired in sometimes. And then there's the genes. There's definitely a genetic quality to dyslexia, but not all dyslexics have those chromosomes. It's numbers 1, 2, 5, and 16 numbers of the chromosomes if you're interested. Bruce Pennington is a leader in that arena if you want to pursue that further. But basically, not all kids with dyslexia have the genetic variety. Environmental practices play a huge role. What you want to find out is, what were they like when they were 3 and 4 years old? And did they go to preschool? Did they go 1 day a week or 5 days a week? Did they have parents who talked with them, read with them, listened to them, elicited language from them? Did they go to museums? Did they have siblings that just overtook the conversation? What were they like? And then in kindergarten, did they get phonemic awareness training? That's one of the most important questions to ask. What kind of phonemic awareness training? Not whole group, I hope, because in whole group, the kids who need just phonological awareness, such as syllables, number of syllables in a word, shouldn't be with the kids who are more advanced, who can tell you the last sound of the word bat, for instance. So very important what kind of instruction they had. Did they get taught phonics in the early years? And if so, how often? Now, here's a definition that Reed Lyon, who was head of NICHD, and Sally Shaywitz put together, but there's a nice definition on the FastBridge website. There's definitions with the International Dyslexia Association. There's a lot of definitions, But basically, it's a specific learning disability, of course, neurological in origin, and it has to do with accurate or fluent word recognition, spelling, decoding, but typically there's a deficit in the phonological aspects, the sound aspects of language. Our sound system is called a phonology system. It's just how we make sounds, all the 44, 45 phonemes that there are and how they're combined. Well, something in that system doesn't work right, so to speak. There are definitely secondary consequences because these kids often have comprehension and vocabulary problems because they're poor readers. Um, but what if we did everything right? Right now, there's no consensus on the incidence of dyslexia. You will read, often you will read, even by people in the International Dyslexia Association, you'll read numbers up to 20%. Basically, I think it's much less, but it depends on so much. What if we worked with pediatricians who did screenings and the new mother meetings? And what if we worked with librarians and parents? So by the time the kids were 4 and 5, they had good oral language and they had good phonemic and phonological awareness training in kindergarten and first grade and phonics the right way. What would happen is the numbers, the incidence of dyslexia would go way, way down. And those kids, as one of my colleagues said, would fade into the woodwork. Because this is not a special ed issue, this is a general ed issue. There's going to be kids that learn this reading process at different rates. And if we catch it early and we do the right things, they will thrive and they will learn. There was one thing I wanted to point out on this slide, the late bloomer kind of concept. I frankly don't like to hear that being used. Well, some kids are just late bloomers. My whole thing is if they're not ready, we need to help them get ready. So if you don't know who Emily Hanford is by now, I would suggest you Google her and look at her articles. Her articles are going viral. They've been on NPR and in the New York Times. She's bringing the reading crisis to the public notice right now, and it's very exciting. I use this arc because I think everything exists on a continuum, and it explains it explains the clumps of different kinds of learners in the area of reading. So at the bottom on the left is that little bit of that 5% or so of kids that are truly, truly special ed kids. And a lot of them were not in the research for the National Reading Panel studies. We don't know a lot about how the real hardcore learners learn to read, like kids with autism and kids that are extremely, extremely complicated. But that next bunch of kids, number 2, the serious strugglers, we know how to teach those kids to read. Often they get sent to special ed, but they're not special ed kids. They're just needing more intense, more explicit, more systematic, more structured reading instruction, and it will take longer. And then you have the moderate strugglers who they're pretty easy to teach. They learn quickly and maybe they just missed something along the line. And then you have the kids who learn to read almost no matter how they're taught, And those kids number around a third of every classroom, even in the wealthy districts, but they don't show up all the time because a lot of those kids have been tutored privately sometimes. But the bottom line is there's about, like in Massachusetts, 51% of third graders reading below proficient, 51%. That's huge. And then, but if you look at the data just from our poorest communities, it goes up between 63 and 67% of third graders reading below proficient. So we're talking huge numbers here. So mostly you've got about a third to half the kids that are reading poorly. And this is all very dependent on demographics, but my point is there's hardly a classroom that doesn't have a third of the kids in trouble. And when you start screening very systematically, you see this all the time. We have to look closely at each child. There's no two alike. And Joe Torgerson, again, did a lot of work with the diversity of kids in a classroom. But are we as diverse when we deliver instruction? He did this graphic of, pardon me, this graphic of simply the diversity of knowledge of letter names. Now, this is kindergarten, and look at the diversity. If we teach these kids in the same whole large group, we're not going to reach each child. So we do have to do small, homogeneous, flexible groups based on the data from the screening tools. So what happens when two children start out about the same, and one is not real strong as a reader, that's the red line, and then the average child, you can see they get further and further apart. That's the achievement gap or the opportunity gap, some call it. And what happens with that poor reader is he's losing information about content. He's losing the information that average reader is reading about dinosaurs or history or space or whatever it is. He's getting further and further behind, and his ego is suffering. Now, Keith Stanovich in 1986 wrote the famous article about the Matthew effect from the Bible, the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. So that applies to reading. And that's what happens to these kids. These children are very, very anxious sometimes, depressed. I have very sad stories in my repertoire of stories about what parents have told me. I mean, there's been suicides, and that's not exaggerating. These are real life kids that have come to my attention over the years. This is very serious, that we are missing a whole lot of kids. Now, for the English language learners, think of that, having a second language as a gift, and try to link the home to the school, bringing in the language from the home into the school. If you have 5 languages or so represented in your classroom, then let's have all the environmental print represent those 5 languages. Invite the families in, let's share the cultural traditions, make those English language learners feel part of the whole milieu. So what can we do tomorrow? Well, George Batsche happens to be one of my favorite presenters, and he is an expert at implementing a literacy plan. And if you can ever get him to speak, that would be wonderful. He goes all over the country. He's talking about building consensus before we do anything else. Get the teachers and the community and the parents on the same page. What are we going to do about these kids that can't read when we know how to teach all but 2 to 5% of kids to read? What are we going to do? So there's consensus tools that he has, and when you look into it, you'll find them. If you have trouble, please call me or write me. And then you build an infrastructure, you build the schedule, you think of the screening tools, you think of the materials, the reading programs, and how it's all going to work. And then you start with the implementation. But you have to build consensus and infrastructure first. There are some stages here that basically go through the whole process of building our response to intervention or multi-tiered system of support. These are the basics, but I would urge you to look at some of the resources at the end of this PowerPoint. Go to the RTI websites, and there's a book that Rachel Brown wrote in the bibliography. This is a big deal, but it can be done with a careful, committed group of people. And some of you are already in that process, I'm quite sure. And when you have a literacy team, there's a lot to do. So let's divide the labor. Let's have a couple teachers or a principal and a teacher or whatever, study what assessment tools you'll use, what curricula will you use, what will the infrastructure be, the schedule and materials and all that. And what about professional development? Do some surveys. What do people know and what don't they know? Bridge the silos. Right now, each of those titles, general ed, special ed, Title I, ELL, or DLL, they all have separate budgets sometimes and separate personnel. And what happens then is you can't get that cross-fertilization that you need. The shared resources, the shared knowledge, the shared attendance at the literacy team. So you want to build bridges so that we can work together, because the very kids who need consistency and repetition often don't get it because these teachers haven't had the time in their schedule to talk to each other, to know what they're going to do with Johnny or Susie. So we want the child to be getting the same interventions from these various people, and they have to reinforce each other, so to speak. This is it in a nutshell. This is what struggling readers need: reading that responds to the big five. Lots of manipulatives, lots of structure, decodable text, not leveled text. Leveled text is okay for the top third of readers, but it won't work with the strugglers. These are non-negotiables that always work. And as George said, it's not what you teach, it's how you teach it. How systematically, how much repetition, and how intensely does it need. Now, this wonderful graphic, I'm sure you've seen. Hollis Scarborough created it with pipe cleaners, and sometimes I use pipe cleaners to have the teachers replicate this. So first thing I want to say is the numbers at the bottom are, they need to all be moved over to the right. That's my fault. So that represents the ages and grades when children are reaching certain stages of skilled reading. If you take the third grade and that number 3 and you put it right where that purple writing is, where Hollis's name is, that's third grade, where that rope gets tight. Everything comes together. So if you go backwards now to the beginning of the strands, you have the 5 strands at the top that represent language comprehension. And you can read them yourselves: the background knowledge, vocabulary, the syntax. All of those happen from birth, prior to birth on, and they're wrapped around because they're becoming increasingly strategic and easier to use. Now, the bottom 3 are the 3 involved with getting the print off the page, the word recognition, word identification, ungluing that print. Now, those 3 are braided because they're inextricably linked. And once all these things come together, you see a couple like donut holes. Well, those are what kids look like in 1st and 2nd grade. And then by 3rd grade, you've got skilled reading. I would suggest you print that, and I've used it with parents and kids, and it's a wonderful tool. Where is the breakdown in that rope for a certain child, though? For Johnny or Susie, we can't fix his problem till we know what piece is broken. So this is a great tool to supplement the screening tools. And the other things you're using to decide where his holes are. And you want to put them in small groups. So reading starts with oral language and listening. You'll read about those in the Common Core State Standards. Oral language becomes print. And I call these low-level language learners, children that really have trouble with oral language and listening, the L4 kids. Just refer to it in my own circle. I don't call them an L4 kid, but basically we want to see how their language is. If it's difficult, delayed, or distorted, as I said in bullet 3, the reading will most likely be difficult, delayed, and distorted. Now, teachers have not often usually received instruction in higher ed about how to build oral language in children. I've kind of developed my own workshops on this, and because teachers, they don't know, and they're grateful when they learn. So these are some of the children that have these low-level language, that are the low-level language learners. And here are some ideas that you can look at later for listening and following directions. It's endless what you can do, but this is a start. And I always ask if teachers have an oral language curriculum, but I haven't yet found a school that does. So we kind of make up our own and grab from this and that. And we have this idea called the talking table. So you take a group of 3 to 5 kids that are at the same level, homogeneous group sessions, and because they should not be forced to talk in front of those high flyers that dominate. And you have like a scene of a farm or a city or a school or a zoo with little figures of animals and people, and you basically make conversations. The idea is to get the kids talking and telling, show me where the giraffe is. Now the giraffe's going to go visit the lion. Walk him over, and what's he going to see on the way, et cetera, et cetera. You make this up as you go along. And it's very effective. And at this center, the kids also have to play listening games, which we all need in this world. Articulation. Do the children enunciate? Do the adults enunciate? We're all guilty. This is a conversation that you can play with when you have a group of people, to bring home the idea that instead of, in the third line, instead of saying, have you been here long? We say, been here long? And if we can just work on articulation for one whole week and build it up as a habit, and with prizes and everything else you have to do to reinforce it, that would be huge. Here is a graphic of a tiered reading, RTI, response to intervention model, with, I think you've all seen something like this, the layers of intervention and extension change as you go through the day. And tier 1 would be more of a whole group, and tier 2 would be more small groups, and they would differ depending on what the children needed. Tier 3 isn't just for special ed, it's for anybody who needs another dose, so to speak. Again, I would urge you to look up, if you're not sure about how to set up an RTI model. I put in a lot of books at the end of this PowerPoint. These are things that work. In-depth professional development for administrators, for teachers, for librarians, for lots of schools that I visited in the South had the physical ed teachers, the art teachers, the music teachers get training also, so that when the child bounced the ball in the gym class, they could bounce it to the alphabet, things like that. Everybody needs awareness of what our children are going through with learning to read. They need more practice than most people suspect. There's a progress monitoring that is, as I've said before, is probably one of the most important things that can be done. Sometimes a new schedule is in order. If you don't know any of these terms or you want more information on leadership roles, I give lots of workshops for administrators, and I've got things I could send you. But there's lots of books now on the market, and for a professional learning community, sometimes the staff reads the same book, etc. More ideas here. A special someone is that third bullet. I've talked to a lot of people who were saved by a special coach or counselor or friend or teacher to really take a child under your wing, because sometimes that's what makes a critical difference. There's a preschool to 3 movement where you build that vertical alignment I spoke of before. That's the name of a book, Making a Difference, 10 Essential Steps. It's a real easy read, very helpful in building a community of pre-K to grade 3 teachers and caregivers in the towns. So you get the private daycare centers and the Head Starts and everybody to be involved, because all those kids are going to be coming into the kindergartens. There's my grandson, James. He's now 3.5, and he has twin sisters, identical girls that are 6 weeks old now. I just was over there this morning holding them, and it's very exciting. But this slide is to emphasize the need for caregivers to listen to children, read to them constantly, talk to them. And there's my daughter reading to James when he was just sweet baby James. And there he is again. I just love showing these pictures. Pardon me for doing this. Explicit teaching. Again, that's what the bottom half or bottom 2/3 of kids that are struggling with reading, and maybe there's only a third in your classroom or your school, but basically they need systematic, structured, explicit instruction, whether it's spelling or writing or math or whatever, but they need, in reading, they need those distinctive features explicitly displayed. And don't commit a suicide and think that they know something. You'll be surprised sometimes to find out how much they don't know. And here we at the bottom of this, you've got I do, we do, and you do. I do it, we do it together, and then the child does it, you do. Now, a lot of kids need a lot of we do's. I don't think they get enough we do's, or we say they don't get enough do-do's. But basically, these routines and rituals and all these ideas here, they're critical. And then you get to phonemic awareness. I'm assuming most of you know about it, but just in case there's a new teacher or somebody online that doesn't know, basically it's the awareness of the sounds of language and the ability to parse them out, to know that cat is the word cat. Now, we're not talking about print. Phoneme awareness is sound awareness, and it's the ability to manipulate those. Say cat, say it again without the k. Let's see if they can do that. And then you eventually map it to print. But in the beginning, you want them to parse out those sounds. And there's many older kids never got this. I've done phonemic awareness with adults, and there's lots of stories about that. They never knew that there were all these sounds. So then the spelling suffers. That's why a lot of people can't spell well, because you have to have good phonemic awareness to spell. And hardly any institutions of higher ed in our area have courses on phonemic awareness. There are maybe, lectures or a workshop on it, but I'm running into teachers constantly that are mystified about what the developmental sequence is and just how to do it. This is a graphic that Connie Dawson, a speech and language pathologist, made when we were doing Reading First, and it's been used so much. People love this graphic. It really helps you figure out, you know, the big picture here. On the left, you've got the easy stuff, the 3-year-old stuff, the rhyming, alliteration, and then you've got the sentences into words, when, you know, how many words in that sentence and how many syllables in a word. And then you get down to sounds. Sounds is hardest, so that's why you don't usually do it till kindergarten. This is a child, a little CJ I tutored, who did not get it. This is a 3rd grader, and I asked him to write his address, and he thought all those years he lived on Cedar Street. And then I wrote the one on the right. He really lives on Cedar Street, but he bunched, you know, lots of things together, and so he couldn't parse out the sounds. But once he learned phonemic awareness, he just flew. I mean, once they learn the missing pieces and practice it and get enough of it, they learn. Little Alicia, 5th grader, super high intellectual capacity. She never knew the rules of phonology. Like, look at number 3. She didn't know the L, S, F, and S rule. The words that are one syllable that end in L, S, F, or Z just have to double those. And she didn't know that. Once she was taught that rule and practiced it enough, she just took off. And she wasn't, I dictated number 7 chomp, and she wrote chup. And so once we got by this and I found out what her problem was, we could move on. There is a developmental sequence, and this is basically a shortened version of it, but in curriculum, you can follow the developmental sequence. For kids for whom English is a second language, they need very explicit training in how to make the phonemes. And this Reading with TLC, Nancy Tellian, that program combines music, art, and visuals, and shows the kids exactly what their mouth position is, and it's fun. Kids love this program. This is another activity to use, making sound changes, dictation. When you're ready to map to print, this is a way of doing it. Now, basically, there should be a couple graduate courses on just phonemic awareness. I've written a couple of those courses. I've taught those courses. So I'm just giving you a very quick and dirty explanation of it. But this is important in terms of phonics now, that we follow a scope and sequence of phonics. And as the children are going through the steps on the left, the letter knowledge, the phonemic awareness, the phonics, etc., they're also, with the red words, learning vocabulary and language development. This is, there's got to be a system. And here's what we call alphabetics. Take an inventory. Let's see what the kids know. That comes from evidence-based screeners. These screeners are invaluable. And here are some activities that are free if you go to those websites to develop letter name knowledge. And Alcone squares, the children put little tokens in the boxes to represent the sounds in a word. These cards have little stickers on them, so each child gets a bunch of the syllable cards. And in a small group, I'll say, caterpillar, show me the card that has the same number of syllables on it. And they'll hold up the card. You can do it the next day with phonemes. And all of this is not simple, but it's invaluable for children's lives and for the future of our society, really, because we're raising a lot of children who graduate without being able to read. I've seen too much of it, and it's hard. But change is good, and it's hard, so we want everyone else to go first. And here are some resources. This is one of my favorite sources for videos for parents and teachers and administrators. Wonderful, wonderful 4 and 5 minute videos. And they're on many topics, trauma and executive function, and lots of, this website is very important. And then different reports that have been out there, different states, resources, be sure to go to Reading Matters to Maine. That's one of the teachers' favorites when I'm doing teachers workshops. And then the Wisconsin Reading Coalition, they've advanced a lot. And of course, I already sang the praises of fcrr.org. And here
Sally,
many.
this is Rachel. I just want to do a time check because we do have a bunch of questions to put forward to you. And I know you're into resources now. So
Let's not
are we
do,
ready for questions?
well, let's do questions because they can look at the resources.
Right, exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And we do have some great questions to put forward to you. The first thing that folks would really love you to do is if you could go back to the slide where you listed non-negotiables and show that again. They felt like they wanted to see that for a little bit longer. So thank you.
I'll try to find it quickly.
And as you're doing that, I'll mention that, yes, this is being recorded and the slides will be available, and you will get an email message about that availability. So just be aware that, in fact, you will get more opportunities to be exposed to this content. So while we put that up on the screen, the next question has to do with a very specific situation. What about an 18-year-old with cognitive disabilities who has expressive language challenges? Are there dyslexic screeners that do not rely on verbal ability? And how would you go about building a plan for such a student?
18 years old. Cognitively, what did you say about the cognition?
There is some cognitive impairment and there are expressive language challenges.
There is cognitive
yeah.
impairment?
Yes.
Okay. And expressive language problems.
Yes.
That's a very, very complex situation. First of all, we don't know a lot about how kids with cognitive impairments learn to read. Those children were not included in a lot of the research. I only know anecdotally that a lot of times the same things work for those kids, but where he has expressive language problems, I really would have to think hard about that. And being he's older, I would want to put him with another older, maybe a study buddy or somebody, a friend, an able reader or something. That's my first thought of how to build up some kind of camaraderie where maybe if he can't express himself real well, he can communicate with this one person who might be a mediator between a teacher and him. I'm not sure I have a quick answer for this. I'd have to really think about that.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. It's a much more complex situation. Here's another one that gets at some needs about children with disabilities, but at a much earlier age. So this is a school that has two preschool classes. One is for children with no language difficulties, and the other has children with developmental disabilities. And many of the children in that class do not talk. Do you think that developmental preschool should have more peer models with good language in that classroom?
Yes, we know from the research that good models are critical. And the trick with this is that there has to be a time in the day when just the low level language learners can be by themselves, of course, but they do need to be around. Like most of the preschools around here have the kids mixed, so they can have models. And then there's parts of, let's say, 20 minutes here and 15 minutes there that we pull these little groups aside.
Excellent, thank you. Here's one that gets at some parent awareness and needs. My district relies on DRAs, teacher input, and running records as benchmarks for the tiered system, and there's no progress monitoring. How can a parent advocate for more database decisions?
Well, I'll tell you, the DRA, if you look at the research, it's not evidence-based. It's not my favorite at all. And what else did you say about level? Let's see, they're probably using leveled readers.
Right. There's no progress monitoring.
No
Um,
First of all, they need to use explicit work, and they don't know what they don't know often, I find. Now that parent, if she contacts me, I and email me, my
mhm,
email is on this PowerPoint, I will connect her with other parents. If she or he doesn't know other parents, she or he can go to Decoding Dyslexia, which is a parent group that has advocated for the right kind of instruction, and they're a very knowledgeable, powerful force of parents. Get involved with the websites, like the Wisconsin one especially. That was built by parents. So is the Minnesota Reads
mhm.
website. The secret is to connect with other parents. Don't do this alone. And there's a book in the back of on the bottom of my, the end of my resources called Failing Students or Failing Schools by Faith Burkowski.
Mhm.
That's a real quick read. It is an answer for a parent. Read that book and then call me.
Awesome. Here's a question about the procedural aspects of teaching reading. Do you recommend teaching letter names in isolation or in combination with the letter sound?
Well, that question is a common question, and um, basically, the research on this is not terrific. But basically, when kids go to preschool or at home, they start learning their letter names. So they come into kindergarten usually knowing some letter names. So then the question is, when do you teach them the sounds? Do you teach them when they're
Mhm.
4 or they're 5? Most of the people that whom I respect are beginning to teach them when they're 4. Like with my little grandson, I start, we have a book on bugs, and I go bugs, and that's called iteration. Or let's take a bath. So it's an awareness. It's not so much explicit teaching at 4 years old,
Mhm.
but it's an awareness that these squigglies make sounds. You start with their name, James, and right now we're working on Paw Patrol, the unvoiced P. That's and then when they get into kindergarten, you look at the scope and sequence of when sounds should be introduced
Mhm.
and letters should be introduced, and basically you want to do it in an order where
Mhm.
the most highly the high utilitarian letters get
Right.
introduced first. So there's a system to it, probably too long to go into right now, but
Right. Yes. Yeah.
is going to do it together, but with a plan in mind.
Excellent. Thank you. Here's a question about a fifth grader identified as having a central processing disorder, and in parentheses, dyslexia, and is reading 1 year below level. Should he have a 504 plan or IEP for testing accommodations and support going into middle school?
Well, this idea of a central auditory processing problem the diagnosis is very controversial.
Mhm.
Um, and so we basically look at what is he doing in reading and writing and spelling, and what is he not doing. And whatever the diagnosis, what he doesn't know has to be taught somehow. And without knowing the politics of that child's school system,
Mhm.
sometimes it doesn't do any good to have an IEP, because
Mhm.
many times IEPs, um, I used to do diagnostic testing at a clinic, and I'd write these big, long 15-page reports years ago, and thinking that whatever I found could be implemented, whatever I found that was needed could be implemented. But sometimes schools just aren't set up for that.
Mhm.
So I don't think he should go much further if he's behind in reading. I would suggest a summer tutor, for sure, because he can't go into middle school with vast holes in his background. But once again, email me, or I mean, these are very complicated
Mhm.
answers that need to be given.
Thank you so much, Sally. We are out of time, and I very much appreciate your sharing from your wealth of information and expertise today. I also just want to let folks know that FastBridge Learning does in fact publish very evidence-based reading assessments that can be used for universal screening, dyslexia screening, as well as progress monitoring. And if you're interested in learning more about the FastBridge Learning suite of assessments, please visit our website at fastbridge.org, and we would be eager to answer any questions that you have about how we can support you in making sure that all of your students are making progress in their reading development. Thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon.